I'm Divya Sridhar, the Policy Director for Digital Equity. This is a subject area that has really grown in terms of need and demand this year as schools had to move to virtual environments very quickly. And for some students, this was an easy transition if they were already in a virtual or a hybrid environment. For others, this was a little bit more challenging, both at the administrative level and also for educators and students and families. I'm fortunate to be joined by numerous state leaders who are trailblazers in the field of digital equity policy. With us today, we have Superintendent James Lane, serving out of the Virginia Department of Education. We have Nick Moore, the Director of the Alabama Governor's Office of Education and Workforce Transformation, and Sam Verghese, the Chief Operating Officer for Florida Virtual Schools. Each of these leaders have unique stories to tell about their key projects. And so I've asked them to highlight one pet project that has really shown innovation and redesign of educational curriculum this year that was offered in their states, or a unique way that they were able to tailor their offering both pre and post pandemic, and some of the best practices and strategies that they can share with us. The way that we plan to run the session, just to make it a little bit more interactive for attendees, is that we want to chunk it out. We'll have the first few minutes, we'll have each of the speakers share their slides and a little bit about this pet project or the specific virtual learning model that they would like to speak on. Then we'll get into a few questions about the lessons learned and how they've been able to tailor the model to a wide gamut of students, and some of the obstacles that each of them have had to overcome during COVID, with everything from funding challenges to the ability to collect data, to uniquely tailoring the platform to a wide variety of students. And then we'll close with a few questions about each of these leaders' visions for the future and how to make progress sustainable for the foreseeable future. Now that we're in this hopefully post-pandemic playing field once we have a vaccine. So without further ado, I'll pass the baton over to Superintendent Lane, who's going to kick it off with a few best practices about the state of Virginia and what he's learned from this time and his pet project.
Yeah, thanks, Divya. And I'm going to pull my slides up here. And while they load, just a thank you to you and ExcelinEd for having me here to talk about Virginia's work today. Amongst the many, many incredible things going on in Virginia as we respond to the pandemic, one of the most exciting projects that we've been doing actually for a few years, but really helped us, is our Virtual Virginia School that I'm going to talk about. In the Commonwealth, we do focus as our primary vision on maximizing the potential of all learners. And what we realized when COVID-19 hit was we really needed to have a solution to ensure that every student had access to digital learning. And we see that there's a three-legged stool to make that necessary. One is internet connection for every student. Two is a device for every student to access the content on the internet. And three is a learning management system to be able to deliver content. Through Virtual Virginia and CARES Act funding, we've been able to make sure that every school division in the Commonwealth has a learning management system. And so just a little bit of back history on Virtual Virginia. Virtual Virginia started actually a long time ago, well over a decade ago, as an online course repository for high school students. Most popularly, it was used, say, students couldn't access a certain world language in their home high school. They could jump on to Virtual Virginia, access our free teachers, and receive instruction in that course. The second most popular way that people access Virtual Virginia prior to the pandemic was we did offer virtually synchronous courses in all of the courses required for graduation. And so students would use our Virtual Virginia offerings to be able to access those graduation requirements. Prior to the pandemic, each school received 15 free slots per school year in every single course. And when the pandemic hit, we actually removed that cap. And now all of the teachers that we have had providing virtual instruction for over a decade are open to all of the schools in the Commonwealth. But probably the most impactful thing that we did was we opened our learning management system that we were delivering instruction through for the last decade to every teacher in the Commonwealth so that every single teacher in Virginia had a learning management system. And so that was the number one thing. Now 100% of our school divisions are using at least one of our Virtual Virginia programs. We in addition to rolling out the learning management system, which cost us about $3.5 million a year, we rolled out K-12 course content so that teachers would have ready-made tools to be able to deliver instruction in the virtual environment. We now provide asynchronous course content, so if students don't have an internet access at home, they can come to the school parking lot, upload and download their information for the week, and be able to work from home in an offline environment. We've actually had incredible stories of school divisions putting internet routers at grocery stores so that parents could upload and download the content that we use in Virtual Virginia. And of course, our local school divisions have innovative offerings as well. But we do give free access to the Virtual Virginia teacher-led courses provided by our teachers in the state-operated program. And so again, here's some of the money that we use to make this possible. From a pandemic standpoint, about $3.5 million to launch the learning management system for every teacher in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We spent about $1.35 million to make sure that all of the enrollments for the synchronous courses we offered were free. We spent about $800,000 to make sure there was content K through 8 because we were primarily a high school program before the pandemic. And about $280,000 to develop asynchronous content that can be used by students if they don't have the internet. And then we just launched, and it's coming live in January, a K-5 pilot where we're now going to do live synchronous instruction with K-5 students, just like we do for the high school students that I mentioned above. Now, Divya asked me to talk about this. Even though a lot of this came together because of the pandemic, we were lucky that we had actually been working on this for many years. You'll see the phrase LEAP up there. That was our acronym for our learning management system prior to this rollout through Virtual Virginia because of the pandemic. And I'm thankful that our General Assembly in Virginia had foresight to fund this project in an ongoing basis. They unallotted it for this year because we were able to use CARES Act money, but the General Assembly is reconvening in January, and our anticipation is that they're going to take back this long-term vision for ensuring that there's the learning management system in every classroom in the Commonwealth. Just briefly, before I turn it over to my colleagues on the call here, we also rolled out nearly $27 million in grants to school divisions to ensure that students had internet connectivity, to ensure that students could have access to devices. And so our school divisions applied for grants through the governor's GEAR grant fund, and we were able to make sure that our students that didn't have access to the internet or students that didn't have devices yet could have access to them. We also launched a TV classroom initiative where we've been doing live TV-based instruction on public media stations, PBS stations, all throughout the Commonwealth. And for our Spanish-speaking students, we launched a partnership with 1380 AM Radio Poder out of Richmond, and they deliver Spanish-speaking instructional content on the radio. Now, obviously, not everyone can get 1380 AM, so they actually launched a free 1-800 line where Spanish-speaking students could call in and get their instruction that's being delivered on the radio through the phone if they couldn't access the 1380 AM portal. It's also streamed online. And then last piece, we launched an open education resource repository where our teachers can drop all of their content into a single repository, reuse, remix it, share it, drop it into the learning management system and use it in their instruction. And so our Go Open VA repository is actually open throughout the nation. And so if you're interested in some of the work that we've been doing to create content, that's open and available to you. So I'll certainly spend more time answering questions later. That's an overview of what we're doing in Virginia, but we focused on content delivery and worked with our school divisions on grants to get them devices and materials. So Divya, thank you for the time.
Thanks, Superintendent Lane. I think that was a really helpful overview, and we'll definitely dig in. I would love to ask your thoughts about, what it took to ensure that the platform was, up to standards or high quality. So we'll get into that. We'll also be discussing some of the steps. You kind of laid it out in a very brief manner, but obviously this probably took months and months, if not years, to bring this platform to fruition. So I would love to hear kind of some of the steps that it took, but we'll get into that after the rest of our speakers kind of share their high-level overviews as well. So with that, Nick, why don't we turn it over to you to share about the platform from the governor's office and how you guys have been able to really support students, especially rural students, during this time.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Divya, and thanks to you and ExcelinEd for allowing us to share a little bit about what Governor Ivey is doing to ensure that we not only have a seamless transition back to a return to normalcy next school year, but also that we're preventing the type of learning loss that so many have discussed and so much of literature points that we might be facing. Also, it's an opportunity in the state of Alabama for us to rethink the ways that we're delivering secondary and post-secondary education, particularly the modalities of learning that will allow us to provide what we've been saying now for 20 years, a 21st century education. And so despite the fact that COVID-19 has been a terrible situation for everybody, we are trying to find a few silver linings in this situation so that we can generate some new best practices as we go back into the way things ought to be. So with that said, I'm going to share a little bit about what the state of Alabama is doing first to institute a new foundation for learning that takes into account competency-based education, that we're instituting a P20W spectrum of learning all the way from birth and early learning throughout the workforce and connecting secondary and post-secondary education. So one thing I'll note that in Alabama 2 years ago, prior to the pandemic, and this is one thing that Governor Ivey was certainly glad we were able to get done before the pandemic started, we codified the Alabama Committee on Credentialing and Career Pathways that's business driven. And in sector strategies, each of our 16 clusters have developed the list of in-demand jobs, competency models, and occupational framework to connect education and the economy for the first time. We say a lot that we want to do more to connect education and the economy, but you have to have a foundation of skills and connect those to competencies that then make up the DNA for a job. So what the ACCCP did is using this 5-star rubric, and everyone can peruse this later to see all the particular elements, but looking at things such as labor market information and making sure that jobs have a pathway to a family sustaining wage and self-sufficiency. We identified the in-demand jobs in each region and statewide. And then we went about developing competency models based on the work of the Urban Institute, the Department of Labor, Education and Training Administration, and we extended the scope and reach of our 16, what we call technical advisory committees of the ACCCP, using establishment-based survey that helped us figure out what are the skills, knowledge, and abilities that employers want to see workers have on day one when they enter into occupations. And what this did was allowed us to operationalize Alabama's two-pronged career pathway model that recognizes by braiding funding through the Every Student Succeeds Act or Elementary Secondary Education Act, the Carl D. Perkins Act, and the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, which for federal laws that provide the bulk of federal funding to the states, those programs were aligned by design for governors to take advantage of the flexibility so that we can combine, for example, secondary, post-secondary CTE and WIOA for youth so that we can compress the pathway to post-secondary learning through things like work-based learning and also dual enrollment and then apprenticeship. And we're focusing on connecting those things so that we have a currency of credentials that are validated by employers. And then at the same sequence and course of study is available to our adult learners, except that they would have a more elongated pathway to entering the workforce, knowing that they may have family obligations that keep them from being able to complete a 2 or 4 year degree in one setting. But these sequences are designed so that we can articulate credit from the certificates and non-degree credentials earned by youth and adults towards a long-term degree. And we also realize that ONET and some of the traditional occupational classification systems, NAICS, SIP, and SOC codes are somewhat static and also very confusing for employers. So what we did was worked with the Lumina Foundation and several other groups to develop the Alabama Occupational Ontology, that's a way for classifying, cataloging, categorizing all of the competencies and the credentials that denote mastery of those competencies. So that way, a lot of this can be done in the background, and what employers and job seekers see is the actual in-demand jobs and the skills that are required to do those things. It's going to help us mitigate degree inflation and also make a skills-based hiring ecosystem to where individuals and job seekers and students are using our learning and employment record to then be able to respond to jobs that take into account the skills that they need to be successful. And so these are just, I won't mention each of these, but we do have a equity imperative, and part of that equity imperative is ensuring that we are promoting credentials and pathways into education workforce training that provide a family sustaining wage and a path to self-sufficiency. And so part of that is making sure that we have a wage premium, and these are stackable, traceable, and portable opportunities that allow people to be the masters of their own destiny in a more individualized hiring and training ecosystem. Part of this work is also powered by our Alabama Credential Registry that recognizes that credential quality, what I was just talking about, is very important, but the other hand to that is credential transparency. And it's very tough for people to understand what they want to be or know the opportunities that are out there if they haven't seen those. And certainly for employers, often it is tough for them to understand exactly the skills and abilities they want to put into a job description if they don't see the industry recognized credentials and other things that are in the ecosystem. And so we're also using a data-driven system powered by our longitudinal data system to connect education and workforce training data. And the byproduct of that is what I mentioned, the Alabama College and Career Exploration Tool that's a verified resume, and also links to things like FAFSA completion and other elements of the talent ecosystem that students and job seekers need to move on to the next phase in their journey. And I'm going to skip ahead here and just focus on something or two things that I want to note in particular is that we also recognize in the development of our 2020 workforce, WIOA combined plan that included Perkins 5 for the first time, that people face steep barriers to entering education in the workforce, even in-school youth. And part of those are benefit cliffs, or the idea that people are facing a marginal tax rate increase when they enter into education and training. So we've partnered with the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta to develop DAVID, the dashboard for Alabamians to visualize income determinations, which is a first of its kind self-sufficiency and benefit cliffs tool that will help people understand, based on family dynamics, geography, career pathway, what benefits do they stand to gain and lose when they enter into education and training, and which ones they might lose. And that helps people to take ownership and have a more data-driven pathway into these experiences. And I'll close by saying that Governor Ivey was very focused on making sure that we had both synchronous, asynchronous modalities of learning during the pandemic. And part of the issue in Alabama is that we do have a dearth of access to broadband. That's been a major imperative for the governor for several years. But in particular, as part of the coronavirus relief fund, the governor devoted $100 million to the ABC program, or Alabama Broadband Connectivity for Students. And it's a fairly simple to use voucher system. And for families that met the criteria of having free or reduced lunch, the Alabama Department of Economic and Community Affairs simply sent them a voucher that could be used to procure high-speed broadband at their home. And as of November 26, we've had over 123,000 Alabama students take advantage of this program. That's in addition to the $170 million, $70 million in to procure equipment for each of our LEAs, and also for health and wellness that the governor provided out of the coronavirus relief fund. Plus, we were able to use some of our ESSER fund, or from our Department of Education, to also procure a learning management system called Schoology that is now providing access to asynchronous learning in all of our LEAs. So that's the highlights of our response, and we're certainly looking forward to working with all our colleagues here to return to normalcy next year.
That's awesome, Nick. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think we can dig in a little bit further, after Sam's portion to talk about some of the state policy levers associated with the ABC program, and also to understand how you've been able to make an actionable difference with regard to quality in aligning students in their college and career and workforce demand needs in the state. So I think there's a lot we can dig into following Sam's session. So Sam, why don't you get right into it? Florida Virtual Schools.
Okay, great. Thanks, Divya. I want to say thank you to you, of course. Thanks to panelists alongside today. I want to thank ExcelinEd for this opportunity to be able to be here this afternoon to talk about some of the great things going on in spite of a difficult environment with COVID. As we start out, just to give you an idea about Florida Virtual, what I think is interesting in the situation where many folks have had to shift and change and adapt in some difficult situations, what Florida Virtual has been doing in an online environment has been very successful with us before COVID. And now as COVID has hit, we have more opportunities to help others in need. What's been interesting during this time is Governor DeSantis, Florida Education Commissioner Richard Corcoran, and our CEO, Dr. Verghese, they've been charging our school with acting with compassion and grace to help in time of need. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the specific things we did in COVID unique to this. I think what would be helpful is also to talk a little bit about what we do, just to have an idea of how we have been thriving in this type of environment, even before, now, and after. When we think about Florida Virtual, what's unique is that we really are today named as one of the 4 vital components of education in Florida, and that's along with the K-12 system, college and university system, and Florida School for Deaf and Blind as well. We've been around, as I said, this isn't our first rodeo to doing this. I mean, we've been around for 23 years. And as you can see from the information on the slide, we have about 3,000 folks involved day in and day out to provide the best for students in Florida and abroad. And we have 2,400 teachers who are specifically engaged in delivering award-winning, interactive, engaging curriculum for students. And when we're talking about curriculum, we've got over 190 courses that we design, we develop, and we deliver this curriculum that's going to meet national standards and that's going to lead to the subject mastery and want to deliver student success through that. So really, we are committed and will continue to be committed to providing every school and every district with valuable resources, customized support, and a rich array of kindergarten through 12 digital courses. So that's really something that's important to us here in Florida and abroad. When I think about this next slide, what's helpful to know, as I said, it's not just Florida alone. I mean, here we are, and you see it in 48 states, 65 countries, 3 U.S. territories. And 74% of states are engaged in what we're doing on the curriculum side when it comes to their statewide virtual programs. So we have great partnerships, and that's such a huge desire for us as an organization, is to help others engaging in that full learning process. And as we know, I mean, every population is going to be different in scope and in reach, and no 2 partnerships are the same. So it's really helpful for us to be involved in that seamless instruction that's going to be in and out of the classroom. For example, as we're probably going to talk more about this, Divya, but just one example was we were able to help Alaska. And that was one example during COVID. And we were able to have really 3-phase type of approach with them to help them ultimately have their own virtual program stood up, ready to deliver and meet that needs of students through this type of COVID environment.
Hey, Sam, one clarifying question, because I think Nick and James kind of touched on this a bit, but would be helpful for me to share with the guests today, attendees today. So is the model using one platform, or is it tech agnostic? So the content can then be used using Canvas or using, a different platform across the board? Just curious.
Yeah, that's a great question, Divya. So the key is, because we develop our own curriculum and we can deliver that, it's going to have many different LMSs that I could integrate with. I think we heard Nick was speaking about Schoology. I think, yes, that's absolutely a compatible platform. Canvas, you name it. Basically, we can deliver that through those platforms to help give that specific state or that district unique access so that their own teachers can access it and use that. And that's basically what's happening in Alaska as well. So their own teachers at the local level are able to meet their unique students' needs the best with curriculum that we've spent our time, effort, energy, and money investing in to develop, so that these local, these LEAs essentially could spend their time doing what they need to do to help those students directly and not necessarily have to spend all their time on curriculum development. So that's just one of the unique things that we do to help. So that I appreciate that question on that. So thinking about that, you got me on a train of thought that I'm just going to want to keep staying on. So I'll try to hold that off for other questions later. When we think about our students, and this gets down to the uniqueness of what we do as well. I mean, we're going to have students from all walks of life. And as Nick and James spoke to earlier, I think that's the beauty of school choice. And that's what we're talking about here, because we're going to find students from all different walks of life who are going to find a home with Florida Virtual School. We're going to have students such as teen tennis star phenom Coco Gauff, who finds a home with us, or the courageous student who's recovering from cancer, who is hospital homebound at the moment. We provide an essential school choice option to help those students, to help those parents, administrators, schools, and districts to make the best choices to help their students achieve their full educational potential. And that's what we strive to do. And that's what I'm grateful to hear, that similar theme from, my fellow panelists today, seeing that desire, hearing that desire to do that. And I think when we consider a couple of the highlights I wanted to say related to COVID before we continue was related to the idea that it brought so much uncertainty. And the charge that I mentioned earlier we got from Governor DeSantis and Commissioner Corcoran and our CEO, Dr. Verghese, was that we wanted to channel that fear into positive action. It was easy for us to be paralyzed by that fear. It was hard to know which direction to go. How do we help? How do we engage in these situations? So we wanted to really do the best we could in that moment with what we were given. And being charged with acting with compassion and grace, we said, let's give our digital courses for free for this time period with COVID. Let's do it for a time certain to help schools and districts who are unsure if they're even going to open up or not. And it was in Florida, thankfully, we're able to open. All of our districts are open now, of course, with school choice options, which we'll talk about later, related to Commissioner Corcoran's directive and his executive order that has come out recently. But we were able to do that at the time with those 100 digital courses. We were able to offer free virtual teacher training for all Florida teachers who were willing to do that and wanted to take the time to put forward that effort. And then we were able to develop and launch an online learning community because we just felt that no one entity needs to have a monopoly on good ideas. We wanted to freely share with students, parents, administrators, schools, districts, best practices. We wanted to give that to them. And then during that same process, we were also able to perform upgrades on servers and systems to potentially have the capacity to support up to 4 million students in Florida when it came to getting to our curriculum, if things really hit the fan and things got really difficult for us. So that's really the summary that I wanted to talk about before I hand it back to you, Divya, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. This has been, I think, very helpful at a high level. Digging into that very first question around high quality and how do we define quality in this time when we obviously, students are facing learning losses, it's all about kind of lowering the benchmarks and kind of giving everybody grace, as folks have mentioned. What are some of the attributes, and we can just kind of go down the panelists, or I mean the speakers, just to learn a little bit about what you guys have been thinking about when you define quality and alignment to the standards in your state. What has helped you make that alignment happen? You want to start, Superintendent Lane?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Well, for us, it's one of the reasons we decided to invest in Virtual Virginia rather than going to a procurement or a vendor-based platform, because we knew that our instruction would be created and led by Virginia teachers. And it would be something that would be there permanently and wouldn't require additional fees and costs in future years. And so at Virtual Virginia, we do hire teachers that know our standards. They know the expectations that we have for accountability. And because the students, even though they enroll in Virtual Virginia, for accountability purposes, they remain a part of their home school. We ensure that the content, the curriculum, and the instruction that we deliver is completely aligned to the Virginia standards.
Nick, you had this in one of your slides, but I wanted to just dig in a little bit deeper. When it comes to CBE, there has been some level of controversy, I would say. You know, when I was with McGraw-Hill, we did a lot of work on thinking through different competency-based education models. How do we align that to standards, and how do we ensure that it meets the requirements of the federal regulations as well when it comes to the Higher Education Act and CBE qualifications and criteria? Could you share a little bit more, Nick, about your thinking from the state's perspective around competency-based education and the kind of I think you mentioned the rubric, but how to align the courses themselves with quality and standards, just high level?
Thank you for that question, because I think that question and all of the issues related to it are going to be the nexus of secondary and post-secondary learning, and honestly will be a matter of survival for a lot of institutions. And part of the issue with competency-based education is that for really up until recently, it's been hard to vouchsafe the quality of competency-based frameworks, and that's because there did not exist a sort of a lingua franca, even at the state, regional, or national level. As you alluded to, there's not a federal standard for competency-based education. If there's any of our friends from ETA, Octay, or anywhere else listening, we'd love to see a concurrent reauthorization of HEA and WIOA that would provide such a framework. But the state of Alabama decided not to wait around for that to occur. And so what we did is realize that industry and our community-based stakeholders were key to create the reciprocal feedback loop that's needed between families, education and training providers, and then the employer community to first figure out what are the jobs that students need to be prepared for. So in Alabama, we've got a plethora of STEM jobs, and we right now have a skills gap because we don't have enough of our graduates that have attained the skills to fill those jobs, and that's something we're working to close. And so that's why we're focused on competency-based education. And it really should not be anything that causes trepidation. Actually, it's very exciting, because what it's allowing us to do is take advantage of the way that technology is allowing us to democratize access to learning. In a more analog world, credit hours and time-based learning were actually just substitutes for the true measurement of learning and mastery of knowledge, skills, and abilities. And so now with technology, we have a way to connect those skills and abilities in a way to denote mastery of those and create a new ecosystem of learning and training. And so I think it's certainly something that we encourage all states to lean into and be excited alongside us about it.
That's great. And Sam, I have a question for you about more generally how to power virtual learning experiences with that data-rich necessity, I think, in this day and age, and how you all have been able to support data-rich analytics through your content. Is there, one way? I'm sure that there's unique, it's not going to be a one size fits all. It's going to be tailored to the school district and kind of what they want out of the experience. But anything you'd like to kind of shed light on from a data perspective?
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I think, Divya, when it comes to having data, it's got to be meaningful. I think a huge part of that has to be what's helpful when it comes to what the local environment is asking for. Actually, it was just hit on when we think about what Nick was just mentioning. A lot of it has to do with having all the stakeholders at the table, and we do that as well. I mean, considering our work with Department of Education, also with when we think about workforce innovation and where the workforce is headed, we've got to figure out, are these data points consistent with helping eventually on this career track with job creation, with helping folks get to where they want to be and meet their potential? So what we try to do when it comes to our curriculum development is we're going to have subject matter experts who are going to be engaged in these arenas and in these areas. And that has to do with our CTE on the career technical side as well. We want to make sure there are experts involved, subject matter experts who are recognized, in their fields that our folks are interfacing with if we don't have them in-house as well. Because eventually, if a job creator, if someone in the industry is going to look to hire people, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for us to create a whole lot of curriculum around something that they're not going to be able to find competency later in, as well, and find a job in later. So it really comes down to, how are we working with Workforce Florida, Career Source Florida, Enterprise Florida, a lot of these entities that we have the job pipeline aspects involved as well. And so it's important for us to recognize how things are looking as globally we're competing. I think education needs to be linked to what's going on and how are we going to help students and families provide, down the road. So those are good questions for us to ask. I think on the data points as well, what's helpful is knowing that we can integrate with all the other LMSs that are out there that are major. So then we can help that meaningful back and forth with that specific district, student, parent, to try to help them get to a good homeostasis of, this is what I'm looking for. This is what I hope I can get out of my educational experience. And of course, in the curriculum process, there's a lot of rigor involved where it's going to be aligned to state and national standards. So we can also have a repeatable experience that people are going to be able to see and understand and measure as longitudinal studies go on as well, when we're thinking over time. So I think the key is that, Divya, and I'll end with this, the key is that as long as the student's at the center of every decision when we're thinking about metrics, we're usually going to be at a good place when it comes to developing this new material.
That makes sense. And not to pick on you, Sam, but just I'm really curious because I think Florida has gone through a lot of interesting shifts over the last couple of years. And I think learning from you about with, Governor DeSantis's recent executive order to shift away from Common Core, how has that played into the experience for Florida Virtual? Have you guys had to make big transitions for your content? And then I'll go around with, to the other panelists and also kind of learn about their experience within their state about aligning not only to the standards, but also state policy, different changes in state policy that had to take place in order to make these projects materialize. So we'd love to learn from you, Sam, and then we'll kind of shift over to the state policy discussion.
Right. And of course, there's been a lot in the news and a lot that's been said about, as the shift is happening, and we know it played out a lot, nationally and locally. Here in Florida, the great thing is that, we have a great partnership with our Florida Department of Education and with Governor DeSantis to be able to say, hey, here's where we're looking to go. There was solid rationale, understanding. A lot of brilliant minds were put together to be able to come up with what's going to be the standards now, which is going to be considered Florida best standards. And the idea is, from our aspect, is we then get to work and say, how do we align our curriculum to meet that? And that's basically why, the advantage of having a curriculum development team in-house helps us to be able to tackle that immediately to then meet that coming need where best standards need to be aligned and adopted and have that learning experience from beginning to end, then be aligned so that students are prepared and ready when those assessments come and when that time comes, for those and of course exams and other things that they're going to have to deal with when it comes to that standard. So the key is, immediately as we knew these standards were coming together and coming out, our team was already considering and in the whole planning process. And to give a shout out to Marty Kelly, our curriculum development senior director, he's got a brilliant team that works on this day in and day out to be able to get this honed to the exact science so that we're able to adapt and adjust as it is. So that's just to give you kind of a big idea of how we have worked with that, with the new standards coming down.
That's great. And that's an exact kind of tribute to the dynamism that's important, the ability to kind of shift so quickly and be able to pivot. And that's exactly why we wanted such innovative speakers here today to talk through their experience and how you've had to go through changes and challenges even prior to COVID and now during COVID, which makes you guys so much stronger, I think, for kind of working through those challenges. So I'm going to turn it over to another question for Superintendent Lane. Wanted to learn a little bit more about your experience with kind of the key steps you would say it took. I know you mentioned kind of the big picture, the big numbers that it took to invest in the learning management system and the platform. But it has been kind of a long time coming. So what were some of the key steps or the ingredients you would say that have helped generate success with the Virtual Virginia LMS?
Yeah, thank you so much. One of the things that I believe, and a lot of us that are on this call look to be policymakers, or at least work in policymakers' offices. And I think that the first time you ask for something, you don't always get it. And so one of the big pieces of advice that I give to policymakers is, if you really believe in something that's really going to make impact, just because you don't win the first time doesn't mean that it doesn't build capacity and knowledge for legislators to consider in the future. And so actually, my very first year at the Department of Education, we asked for the funding for a statewide learning management system. At that time, we thought it was going to cost around $7 million, a huge initial fee, and then ongoing fees closer to the number that I shared earlier. And it didn't even make the cut, right? It didn't make it into the governor's budget. We came back the second year. The governor put it in the budget the second year, started to see the value of us being able to share content across schools, across grade levels, bringing students together across division boundary lines, and all the incredible social experiences that can happen in a virtual space that can't happen in an in-person classroom all the time. And like I said, then the General Assembly got more excited about it because the governor got more excited about it, eventually funded it, and then COVID hit and we lost it and had to find other ways. And so the second thing I'd say is we had to be really flexible. When we originally designed this project, you saw in my slides that it was called LEAP. We designed it as a budget amendment that would go through our General Assembly process, and that we would operate the learning management system at the state level. When we got the funding and then lost the funding and then COVID hit, we knew we had to do it anyways. So we brought CARES to the forefront. Well, it gave us an opportunity to realize we had already built a structure for this with Virtual Virginia. And rather than building a learning management system on our own, we should partner and reinvest in some of the tools that we already had. And so we took plans that we had made through the policy making experience, revised them. And when we were able to go into Virtual Virginia, we were able to reduce that $7.1 million cost of building our own down to $3.5 million. That became a lot more palatable for our policymakers, for the governor, for legislators. And the fact that we could fund the startup and that really we were only asking for ongoing funding was huge. And that's Nick talked about reenactment of WEO. It's why grants, especially during pandemics or recessions like we've gotten in the past, are so important, because it does allow us to invest in innovation. Because sometimes these very difficult times like pandemics and recessions require us to be innovative to make our way through it. Obviously, we'd rather never have a pandemic. We'd rather never have a recession. But when we have an opportunity to invest in innovation, I find that our educators really step to the plate. And so it was a long time coming, and it took flexibility. It took change. It took rethinking what we wanted to do. It took coming back to the table even after we had lost some battles earlier on it to get it to where it is today.
So Nick, I have a question for you about the Alabama Broadband Connectivity Program. I think that's a really innovative opportunity to help get all students connected in Alabama, or at least the most at risk and most high priority students who need connectivity at home. I wanted to kind of dig in a little bit deeper into what steps and what policy levers you guys had to pull to make that come together in such a quick manner. I think it would be a great, very replicable success story that we should really be passing along to other states to do much of the same for those students who are kind of left out right now, who have that homework gap and have had that for so many years, and now they're facing this much bigger gap of a lack of online connectivity at home. Could you share that?
Thanks, Divya. And a lesson that Alabama has learned, I'm sure we're all learning, is that when it comes to doing the tough things that we know need to be done to make true for our kids, such as expanding broadband access to every home in the state so that we don't have a homework gap, and so that we're not seeing some of our most socioeconomically depressed areas not have access to the internet to take advantage of competency-based learning and new innovations in learning. And so what we have recognized and what we want to continue to demonstrate to our partners in the legislature and throughout the state is that today is always the time to start making the investment, because we don't know what the next problem will be. I mean, and so if anything, the fact that Governor Ivey, through her strong leadership, and it always begins with the governor's leadership, using her convening authority and also her ability to get people excited about something, was key. And we have to begin now, not resting on our laurels and thinking about, well, we happen to start making investments in broadband and thinking about broadband access in Alabama in 2020 in the same way that the FDR was thinking about rural electrification with the Tennessee Valley Authority in 1935. It's the same existential need for us to provide that access. But so today we have to be thinking about what's the next step that will take when we get to universal access. What are the other types of infrastructure that we'll need to invest in so that we're prepared for the next challenge? And the only way to figure out the answer to that is, as Superintendent Lane has said, to make sure that we've got all stakeholders at the table. And that also includes parents and families. And what we've learned from a lot of our communities is people don't need anyone to come in and tell them what to do. They need people to come in and listen to them. And really, it's resources that are needed. And so we plan on spending the next months and years listening to our constituents, particularly those that are in our most rural areas, so that when the next shoe drops, whatever that may be, we find ourselves in a position to be slightly ahead of the curve as we found ourselves when it came to broadband and new modalities of learning.
Yeah, that's super. Just saw one question rolled into the chat, and we have about 15 minutes left, so I want to make sure we address that before diving into a few other questions we were thinking about discussing. This question's, well, I think it's more of a comment, but I think it lends itself really well to a question. Alice here mentions that we're seeing some states, like legislation that's been introduced in Texas, that are thinking about substituting art or music credits for CTE credits, which might feel like you're shortchanging students on teaching some less creative skills. I've also seen this with my experience with ESSA, with kind of diving headfirst into ESSA's Title IV program, and that's a block grant program that really allows for investments in one of three categories. Effective use of technology, you have well-rounded curriculum, and then safe and healthy schools. And all three of those buckets have to share this one large block grant at the federal level. And you're seeing that, states are doing something very similar as well when they have to parcel out the funding, and schools have to kind of decide how the funding is used, which can sometimes feel like what Alice said, you're shortchanging those students from an experience that they really deserve, that should be well-rounded. So just thinking a little bit more granular about how we can avoid that. Nick, Sam, James, any thoughts about how to ensure that students are getting a really well-rounded experience? And maybe we even dive into thinking about social and emotional learning. How do we bake that into the virtual learning model? Just curious.
I'll jump in first, I guess, as the former band director on the call. First, I appreciate the question coming from Alice here. I'm not a fan of necessarily substituting requirements for the arts for other requirements. I think we can make space for the arts and career and technical education and core instruction and health and physical education in our schedules. Most of our states have, for the standard diploma, 21 credits. Most kids have the opportunity, even on a 7-period schedule, to take 28, if you're on a block schedule, maybe 32 credits. I think there's still room for 4 years of band as the former band director, while still being able to learn a trade and the things that can prepare you for jobs. I know many of my friends through my band experiences, did not go to college, went directly into the trades. And so making sure that they have a skill that can prepare them for life after graduation, while developing their critical thinking and their college resume, if they decide to go that route, is something that we should be thinking about for every student. And finding the balance is a tricky job for counselors, but it certainly can be done. And as policymakers, we got to make sure that we're not putting so much requirements on graduation and on students so that they miss the opportunity to explore their interests as well as their trades and their needs and their core instruction. That's my take on it.
And I'll add that I think we just know anecdotally, and certainly I think we'll know empirically quite soon, the degree of traumatic experiences that our students are facing right now. And I think we have to be very intentional about not circumscribing an experience that would maybe deprive them of some of the things that are going to be most meaningful as they recover from these traumatic experiences. And I certainly echo Superintendent Lane and feeling that we can walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. I think that's why governors are important and putting a vision out for braiding funding. And, governors have a strong role in developing the Perkins 5 plan, and also looking at things like concurrent credit. So, for example, in Alabama, we're allowing computer science to also count as a mathematics credit, because we understand that when, as I said earlier, we're trying to look into ways for students to earn associate degrees and complete an in-school youth apprenticeship and still have somewhat of a life. So if a kid wants to, have relationships, be in the band, play football, we can make that possible also while they're earning academic and technical credit. And as we are going more towards the idea of not college or career readiness, but career pathway readiness, I think we have to be very careful about also calling too many balls and strikes ahead of local leaders and also families and students, because I think they know best what needs to be part of their well-rounded experience.
Yeah, and I would add, I appreciate my colleagues' comments on this. I'd just say specifically at Florida Virtual, give you a personal example. My own son, middle school, took a guitar class this summer. Learned guitar over the summer, or at least got more proficient in it, I hope. I think he did, when it came to learning a new instrument. And that wasn't a requirement. He didn't have to take it. It was an additional class. It was something we offered. It was something he was able to do for free, through Florida Virtual School. And to Superintendent Moore's point, that's my decision as a parent. That was my choice of wanting to push my son harder in the summer rather than doing something else. And I think that's where that flexibility can come into play and say, are there other options? And that's one reason we're one of the 4 key components in the state, because we are an option when it comes to choice that parents could choose if maybe they want to take their child on a different track. Maybe they want to do something different that's not a traditional role. Like I mentioned, Coco Golf, who's out in Australia and she still has to figure out a way to have learning gains, in what she's doing. So I just throw that in there too. I think that's where my colleagues are saying, let's be creative about this. We can do it all at once. Walk and chew bubblegum, great statement, right? We can absolutely do all of that at the same time.
That's great. Shifting to students that really do have alternative needs and being very cognizant of the fact that virtual models work great, but it's very difficult to tailor the experience, especially for students with alternate needs and disabilities. Would love to kind of dig in. I know my home state of Texas, where I grew up, they put out some great guidance in a very timely manner. The state put out this guidance on the TEA, and the guidance was specific to the phased approach that schools can take to support students with alternate needs using virtual learning and using a technology-based model. Can you guys comment a bit about how your models are supporting, these students who have kind of unique learning needs or abilities?
Well, I can jump in and say that in Alabama, we feel like our new learning management system, certainly our Atlas on career pathways, our longitudinal database system that does connect our education workforce data, but also data not at the individual level, but we want to make sure we've got an N size of at least 10. But we do have on the flip side of that and macro version, as I mentioned, our Alabama College and Career Exploration tool, and that's a powerful tool for families to individualize and take ownership of their child's academic progress, and also for those transitions between teachers, between school years, to not lose anything in regard to the parents understanding where their child is, because they will be able to have their child learning and employment record that contains their progress from year to year. That's also a powerful advocacy tool with students that have an IEP or a 504 plan if they move districts or if they move from one place to another. And certainly the transferability of learning experiences on the learning management system is also going to help our teachers that are supporting students that may have a special need in living out that IEP or 504 plan to fidelity. So we see that these are powerful tools to expand the ability for us to meet the needs of our students. And it's not in any way something that should be feared by anyone, really, if we're doing it right, because this is just so much of a more dynamic tool that we have now, rather than just a traditional static system.
And I'll just add, as we're talking about students that have greater needs, I think it's important to remember that whereas we're all excited about the strides that we're making in digital learning that have somewhat been forced upon us by the pandemic, virtual learning is not for every student. And I think virtual learning is going to be a component of every student's education. And in Virginia, in fact, we have a requirement even before the pandemic that every student have an online course before they graduate, which we think set us up for success when we had to go to virtual settings when the governor closed schools in March. But we know that some of our students, especially those with the greatest needs, and I would say those would be students with disabilities, English language learners, our pre-K through 3 learners, whereas we're getting by, we're responding to a global crisis with virtual learning. I don't think that I would recommend that for every student as the predominant way that they learn when this is over. And I don't think anyone would. And so, even in our 3-phase planned open schools, we prioritized equity in those most vulnerable learners to come back first when we started opening schools. And so phases 1 and 2 brings back those students even before we get to the hybrid models or in-person models. And so, yes, the digital tools that we're creating can be used as resources when we get into the in-person learning for blended learning environments. But some of our students are just not going to be successful until we get back to in-person learning. And obviously we need better masking, better physical distancing, of the vaccine to come through for all of that to be possible. But I don't see virtual learning being a panacea for every student.
That's really helpful. Yeah, Nick and Sam, do you want to comment briefly? I know we're almost at the end of time, but I want to comment briefly or piggyback on Superintendent Lane's thoughts about kind of the future of learning and what we see as maybe the ideal state as we head back into schools post-pandemic. What are you guys envisioning for students?
I guess I'll go ahead first, James. Good with that. Just thinking about an ideal state, it's always the goal, right? We always want to think about what's the ideal state, whether we're in crisis mode or not. And so much of this is, I think, shown and given us an understanding of the art of the possible. When there's pressure and when there's stress, people bring their best or their worst. It's one or the other. But definitely we can say when it's come to educational gains, and what I've heard from my colleagues up here, they brought their best. We've all tried to bring our best to bear. And what this COVID environment has done that I've seen more than ever has brought districts and local education agencies together to better the situation in ways that they maybe weren't thinking of before. So I think, just that the continued collaboration is huge. It's huge because it's so much more than just the education arena. This has now become a mental health issue where I know on our end, First Lady DeSantis, has had a huge mental health initiative that has related to all of this. And we talked about social emotional learning is such a huge part of this whole process. So I just think overall, when I think about what's better, it's knowing that now forever professional development in this arena for teachers is going to involve a digital component. I mean, I think that's forever changed in a positive way. And to James' point, we have the same requirement in Florida for one online class. We've had that for many years, which I think has really helped when we've come to a situation like this, and for students in their career goals later as well, to have that component. So I think just seeing the ability for people to have more of an open hand and a closed fist when it comes to ideas and when it comes to working together, being more open-minded to how do we solve a difficult problem and not be territorial I think that's been maybe the biggest encouragement to me, because I think that's when real innovation happens, is when people are willing to say, you know what, I don't care who gets the credit. I'm just going to put my good idea out there. And I hope someone in the legislature, I hope a governor picks it up and we can make this thing happen. So that's what I would say in relation to that.
Nick, any final thoughts?
I wholeheartedly agree that we're not virtual learning and complete immersion in virtual learning is a stopgap. And I know in Alabama, our teachers have been doing yeoman's work every day and have worn themselves out to the point of exhaustion. I'm sure teachers in every state have done so and are continuing doing a great job. That is not a sustainable model for our teachers or for our students. And so the sooner we can get a vaccine and are able to get students back into the classroom, we have to do that. Now, I think moving forward, we're going to recognize that there will be a greater balance. And I think that there has been, over the last several decades, a very gradual and somewhat circumscribed sort of trudging into the new world of delivering instruction that relies much more heavily on virtual and asynchronous instruction. And I think we will see that that is a larger part of the mix. And certainly what we want to do is make sure that we are eliminating any gaps in equity there. And we want to make sure that systems in the state that don't have as much local money or don't have as many resources, that we're not, as we go further into a more technology and virtual heavy way of educating our kids, that we're not baking into the cake an inequitable distribution of those funds and of that type of learning. So that's going to be a big focus in Alabama, and make sure that those areas of the state that are struggling the most during the pandemic, that we don't build in a permanent, a way for them to be permanently behind in that regard.
Great. And I'll just close out by saying, I know we're a couple minutes over, but really appreciated learning more from each of you all. And I think what the big theme I'm hearing over and over being echoed is that those states that have been more prepared have sacrificed less during this process and have really seen greater gains. So just hopeful that everyone who's attended the session and who can hear from you all can really learn from the best practices that you all have lived through, and that we can all be just more informed and more prepared going forward. So thanks again for your time, everyone. And thanks to all the participants who've been able to join today's session. Really appreciate it. And stay safe and healthy, everyone. Have a good one.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.